Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
All right, welcome everybody to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson. And in a recent episode of the Making Sense podcast, Sam Harris interviewed Jack Goldstone, who is apparently, you wouldn't know it by listening to him, the leading expert on revolutions. I guess to talk about the possibility of revolution in America, looking at the events of January 6th, because I guess from those who are suffering from serious Trump derangement syndrome, January 6th was potentially the fall of the entire American Republic. But I should say right at the beginning, I've listened to Sam Harris for a long time. I read his books, The End of Faith, Letter to a Christian Nation. I enjoyed his book on lying. I really like his work on meditation. I loved the Waking Up book. I used the Waking Up app to help do, specifically mindfulness meditation. And I like the conversations that go on that platform. And so I've gotten a lot of value from Sam Harris's work over time. But there is a side to Sam that I find annoying and disconnected from the rest of his work, which he's sanguine and logical in many aspects of his intellectual work, but he's got this dead fast commitment to neoliberalism, and it produces in him a series of political positions that I just find baffling. And I think the underlying problem stems not just from a bad political perspective, but actually a deep philosophical problem. Because I think Harris is a philosophical idealist. So he thinks that ideas, more so than social conditions or basically anything else, determine or explain the acts of individuals, groups, or even entire civilizations. The reason we see violence in the Muslim world is because of the beliefs of Islam, Sam Harris will say. Others will argue, obviously, maybe U.S. imperialism and intervention has something to do with it. But for Sam Harris, as was famously expressed in a dialogue he had with Noam Chomsky, basically that it's the major cause of the unrest in the Muslim world is the ideas of Islam. That, America may not always live up to its moral position in the world, but it's generally a force for good. And so then the only causal explanation for Islamic terrorism are Islamic beliefs. And I think this idealist position just clouds Sam Harris's view. And I think this is nowhere more apparent than on the podcast episode we're going to talk about, the one about revolutions. I think it should be noted that Sam has never really discussed the issues of socialism or Marxism at all on any of his podcasts or any of his platforms. He's never had a respected leftist like Richard Wolff or Chris Hedges or somebody like that on his podcast. He doesn't take Marxist thought seriously. He's never commented on it. He just rejects it hat in hand. And, I thought maybe, when I saw that he had an episode on revolutions, I was like, all right, maybe this is an opportunity to hear what Sam Harris has to say about all of the revolutions that happened in the 20th century. Maybe we'd hear a little bit of a more nuanced discussion of Marxism and the beliefs of at least Marx's idea of revolutions. But of course, it didn't happen. Marxism isn't even mentioned in this entire podcast episode. Socialist is only mentioned once, and it's maybe there's liberal Democrats or socialists or something, but it shouldn't matter. It's just mentioned off the cuff. It doesn't matter. So for me, I think this needs to be corrected. And I think that some of the things that were said on the podcast are so outrageous that they have to be contested. And to do that, I've brought in this crazy cast of characters. First and foremost, Brett O'Shea, host of the Rev Left Radio in his wonderful robe, as is appropriate. Cinar Achin, the co-host of All Things Co-op with yours truly, and a sensible socialist veteran, Aaron Firouz. So, guys, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So, all right. What we're gonna do here is we're just gonna kind of play some of the clips that I thought were emblematic of like what what the issue is, and then we'll kind of discuss that as we go. So,
Could I say something really quick up front?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, you said just about Sam Harris, and I just want to reiterate that I also have read all of his books. I'm a fan of like his Waking Up app and his book. I think it's really important when people come, especially intellectuals that I know want to get into meditation. I actually offer Waking Up as the book for them to read because it has that scientific materialist bent that speaks to like a modern day Western intellectual. But I think that's what makes him worth responding to. It's not that he is a wholly lazy or knee-jerk reactionary. It's that he does have real insight into certain aspects of life, and somebody of his caliber should be held to a higher standard. And like a part of me almost hopes that some of this sort of stuff will leak through to him and he'll eventually come around and open up those conversations to the left. But as I said before we started recording, his big thing when it comes to politics is he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He's ignorant of his own ignorance. And for somebody who champions free thought and free speech and is all about open and honest dialogue between different interlocutors representing different positions, it is a glaring hole in his entire work that he does not engage at all with the left in any sense. Even like a social democratic or democratic socialist left, he doesn't even engage with. His one chance was with like Chomsky over Islam and imperialism. Chomsky sort of made a joke of him, just revealed that ignorant aspect of Sam Harris, and it just got nowhere, and it was sort of embarrassing to even read through that stuff. But that's why I think it's worth responding to, where somebody else on the right or some other reactionary wouldn't even be worth our time, you know?
Yeah, I think there is a sense too that Sam Harris, along with other members of the so-called intellectual dark web, have kind of been an agent of mockery for a lot of people and a lot of commentators on the left. Like there's a sense that like we don't even have to take this guy seriously because of these serious limitations. But I think you're right, Brett. I think this is a person with significant intellectual capability, a huge audience, and this whole perspective of like honest dialogue. And there's this dishonesty that is so frustrating when you agree with the idea that there should be this kind of free interchange of ideas, and you want to have these ideas that we think are really important enter into that conversation. And he's just we could do a sort of sociocultural analysis of Sam Harris's upbringing, and he did come from a relatively well-off background and was able to spend 10 years in India doing meditation because I guess he didn't need money, or it wasn't that big of a deal. And so you could do all of this kind of analysis to try to pin him down to determine he doesn't care about Marxism because he's like a bourgeois elitist or something. And he's obviously rich and stuff like that. But, I have a little bit more respect for someone who gets rich because they write a book that becomes popular than somebody who gets rich because either they were given a bunch of money and then used it to exploit other people. So it's one of those things where it's like he can have a bourgeois perspective without necessarily always, being of the hot bourgeoisie. And I think that if you're going to argue that we should have free dialogue, you should be able to set that aside and be able to put on your philosopher's hat and contest with a major aspect of 19th, 20th, and going to be 21st century philosophical thought. I mean, Marxism is not something that a serious philosopher laps off. They deal with it, and maybe they reject it. Maybe they have arguments as to why it doesn't work for them, but they don't just make jokes about it, which is what Sam Harris does. It's fucking annoying.
Exactly.
All right. So in this first clip is basically the guest Jack Goldstone giving the gist as to what he thinks is the sort of general explanation of revolution.
In general, across the centuries, there's a pretty persistent pattern. And it goes back to some of the wisdom that Roman leaders shared among themselves. And that is, when you work for honor and the richest and most powerful members of society try to enrich and make their society as a whole stronger, the society flourishes. On the other hand, when the rich and powerful simply try to protect and extend their own wealth at the expense of others, the society sooner or later collapses. So that's the general picture. And you might say, well, elites know that. Why would they do that? The answer is, when a country gets rich and elites are in competition with each other, they often fall back on just kind of keeping score with how they do compared to their peers. And they think, well, the rest of society will just go on. It's not my problem, not my issue. And so then you get people trying to accumulate more and more wealth to protect it from taxation and to prevent public services from being fully funded. And all of that leads to the rest of society growing more and more angry because they have a sense that they're falling behind, they're being left out. The government no longer is watching out for them. And so they turn against it. They turn against the government, they turn against the elites, they get angry, and they look for ways to let that anger out, usually joining some radical or extremist movements.
All right. So curious what your thoughts are of that. The idea that essentially revolutions happen because elites who used to care about the general good stop caring about the general good and only start competing with each other. And the rabble, I guess, get mad about that the elites are no longer serving the public good. And so they join a radical organization. I don't even know where to begin in terms of the lack of depth, or I mean, this seems like a strange game theoretical kind of way of like historicizing all of like social relationships, and just like all societies are basically the same, and so there's always going to be elites and there's always going to be like a rabble, and it depends on whether the elites care about the rabble or not, whether or not you're going to have a revolution. This is so crazy. It's hard for me to even see why we should take this person seriously, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I could go ahead and start off the conversation. The main thing I think that he does wrong here is he locates the sort of locus of change or stability in a society, as you said, Kevin, in like the moral and behavioral machinations of the given elite. And moreover, he says that the elite know this. So it's like the elite are conscious of and privy to the fact that all of society's stability relies on their behavior. And yeah, as you also said, it takes the elite for granted, as if revolutions are, products of elite behavior. And there's nothing about systems. There's nothing about, modes of production would be asking way too much. There's nothing about the material conditions in which the masses live. In fact, the masses are sort of drawn out of this picture, except to be automatons that express anger after the elites push things too far. And so this is somebody, again, this is why it's so absurd, is it's not just somebody talking with his friends in a bar. It's somebody who's an expert on revolution. And this is the analysis we get. This, as you said, ahistorical, idealist, absurdly reductionist understanding of history from somebody who is supposed to be an expert on it.
Yeah. Aaron, Cinar, what do you guys think?
I agree. I mean, I think that's probably the best way to put it. It's a very reductionist argument to where it's, and that is kind of what the entire episode is about, is where, the elites and the extremely wealthy have basically shirked their social responsibility, whereas before it used to be okay when there were robber. He literally says this. He goes, well, we've always had robber barons, we've always had oil tycoons and rail tycoons, but they used to give more of a shit. It's like, it's not really the core of the problem. I mean, that is a problem, I suppose, but that's not getting to the fundamental issue, is that these people have hoarded these wealth and resources built on exploitation. None of that is ever touched in this argument. So yeah, I think it's very reductionist to say, well, the main issue is just that they're not philanthropic enough anymore. It's absurd.
Yeah, I mean, I have to add to that. I mean, it is absurd in its regard to the elite kind of being the main mechanism of historical development in this regard, and not giving any credence or any. I think it's intentional in a way, in a sense, to not give any credence to popular movements, social movements, in which the progress of history has been defined in many regards. In which we've been able to civilize the form of capitalism that we have, from bottom-up movements to really rectify a lot of the injustices we see around our lives. So, yeah, I mean, it's simplifying it. I think it's boiling it down to the elites are the only ones who have agency in history, and also probably to a certain degree about human nature is fixed in a certain way, and that's how things are. And so, not much you can do about it until the elite realize that they've done wrong, and then maybe they'll change things. But yeah, I agree with everybody. Yeah, it's pretty reductionist. Yeah,
it's pretty clear who the audience is to me, right? It's not the masses of people. Like, you're just crazy people who are going to join some radical organization when it gets bad enough. My communication is to the elites. Elites, please, again, save us, because that's, I guess, what you're there to do. I gotta. We were saying this before too, but I gotta do a shout out to the real lead main guy when it comes to revolutions in the present day, which is Mike Duncan with his Revolutions podcast. Because I think if you listen to his History of Rome podcast, this Goldstein guy's not read or understood his Roman history, because there were a lot of Roman elites who didn't give a shit about the plebeians, and the society radically advanced. It wasn't because the elites in Rome cared about the rabble that they were able to stave off, revolutions for 1,000 years. I think the sort of reason that you understand why the fall of the Roman Republic and then the fall of the Roman Empire happens is because you look at the social movements that are coming from within and without, rather than looking at simply the behavior of the elites, because ultimately the behavior of the elites matters little, especially when the whole role of the elites is to simply steal the wealth that's created by the vast majority of the population, who usually don't have a say at all. All right.
Couple things real quick.
Go.
Some things that were excluded. I mean, obviously, we've all mentioned this in different ways. There's no class conflict. It's sort of a downstream effect if it happens at all, and it's a manifestation of anger, not material needs. There's a naturalization of hierarchy, this notion that there will always be elites and there will always be people underneath them. The idea, which is very anti-Marxist, that the elites are sort of a coherent social class that more or less shares a set of visions and goals and histories. And Marx, told us very clearly, and we all know this with our own eyes, the ruling class in any sort of given epoch is highly split, has factions within it, doesn't agree on how to move forward, etc. And there's also, throughout this entire episode, and it's almost trite to say at this point on the left because it gets used so much, but horseshoe theory, right, is like the left and the right are just this homogenous whole. It's like you go too far away from liberal centrism and you get extremism, radicalism. Now, there's no differentiation whatsoever between a neo-Nazi wanting to usher in a white ethno-state and a socialist or communist wanting to restructure the economic and political system so that everybody has an egalitarian stake in society and a chance to improve their own lives. That is completely eradicated. And the last thing, of course, is a good Marxist understanding of history, and somebody like Mike Duncan reflects this, not explains, but reflects this in his work, is that historical processes happen above and beyond often the conscious grasp of any individual or any set of individuals within that society. History is moving, and a lot of times people in their own consciousness are playing catch up or trying to interpret it, but history moves on regardless. And so that's as true for the rabble as it is for the elite or any subsect of those classes. And so this sort of ahistorical notion that these historical processes are in the conscious grasp of and more or less control of the elite is just another absurdly ahistorical approach to any topic concerning political revolution.
Yeah. And so as the conversation continues in this episode, there is always this sense. I wrote a tongue-in-cheek little blog post called Sam Harris the Socialist, and did a podcast episode about it, basically saying like Sam Harris seems to be able to identify kind of some of the main problems, and even in this episode you'll hear it, like there's a system problem, but then just never crosses the line where it's like, oh, like here's why. And I think part of it is because he's listening to people like Goldstone, because as we'll hear in this clip, he says, look, the main issue of our day has got to be wealth inequality, right? Like wealth inequality has never been higher. Like, that's why people are angry, right? And Goldstone tells him, no, it's something else. So let's listen to that.
I think you wrote in a piece that you published with Peter Turchin that, and I'm quoting you, inequality and polarization have not been this high since the 19th century. I think we're probably going to want to focus on wealth inequality, but what are the important measures of inequality? Can you put some numbers to this in the U.S.? And is there anything other than wealth inequality that is a major driver of this problem?
Well, there certainly are many inequalities besides just inequality of wealth, and inequality of wealth is probably not the most troubling.
Oh, interesting. That's great, because my assumption coming into this conversation is that wealth inequality is really the elephant in every room now. And so, yeah, please fill in the gaps in my knowledge here.
Okay, look, we've been through this before. We had the railroad robber barons, we had the Rockefellers and the Carnegies build up huge amounts of wealth. But when they did so, other parts of society were benefiting as well. That is, the railroads and the oil industries employed lots of workers and gave them opportunities.
Yes, very good for that.
What we've had in the last 30 years with the rise of finance and digital fortunes is the rich getting richer while everyone else stagnates or grows very slowly indeed. And it's more the differences in opportunity, in social mobility, in access to what I would call middle-class amenities, a safe neighborhood, good schools for your children, medical care, the ability to have a varied diet. Those things have, even though the price of a color TV has gone way down, the price of a new automobile has gone way down, the things that are essential to quality of family life remain competitive and therefore expensive, and in many settings, increasingly beyond the reach, both of young people and people who don't have college degree professional positions. Now, wealth inequality harms society if those who are wealthy use that to get control of government policy and steer that wealth in ways that benefits themselves. If they are generous with the wealth and use it to endow museums, universities, to invest in new businesses, to rehabilitate districts, then that's fine. That's good for society. So a lot of it has to do with how wealth is deployed and how income and opportunities are distributed. And it's the fact that the use of private wealth and the distribution of opportunities really seems to have diminished for large portions of the population, maybe 30 to 50% in many of the advanced Western countries. And so you have a lot of that anger, the yellow vests in France, people in Chile who rioted against their government, people in Brazil who rioted at the cost of bus fare going up. These are people who feel like they're just getting by, and every imposition upon them is increasingly pushing them over the edge.
So it's goddamn, this is frustrating, because you hear these things where like people are super pissed off at the fact that the society is not giving them the things that they want. And then you hear, but it's not because of wealth inequality, like that could be deployed to help that. And it's like, yeah, if somebody fucking takes it away and, and forces those people to reinvest it towards the social good, but those motherfuckers never do. And it doesn't take much of like an understanding of the oil boom and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies to understand that you might have Carnegie libraries, but the motherfucker told people to gun other people down, right? So it's the idea that there's just this half look at the role of like deployed wealth. And I this is another shameless plug, but I wrote a blog post called "The Poverty of Philanthropy." That philanthropy is a total joke. Like, it's just a way to distribute money to the projects that you want, and almost always for the purposes of avoiding taxation. So it's not because you really give a shit. Like, does anyone really think that Bill Gates gives a shit? No. Look at the number of people he's exploited to the degree that he's exploited to get the wealth that he has. Does anyone really think that Elon Musk gives a fuck about anything but his vanity projects? which I think are cool, by the way. I like SpaceX. I think it's cool. It's a cool company. It sucks to work at SpaceX, but damn, they do amazing things. But look who's lining their pockets with that shit. It's not the workers at SpaceX. It's Elon fucking Musk. And he doesn't care. And so it frustrates me to hear this close analysis of the identification that people are upset because their position is not getting any better, but the divorcing this from the process of wealth extraction from those very people. The idea that deploying wealth to invest in businesses and like the oil tycoon was good because people were being employed. It's like, no, there's a goddamn socialist movement that was forcing 8-hour days and decent work conditions and all this kind of stuff, which again, like we said, is completely avoided. It's the historical analysis is just strangely like on point until it needs to divert at the last possible moment to make sure that we don't talk about those scary people with the red flags, because they put a bomb on Wall Street, and that's scary. It annoys the piss out of me.
Kevin, I mean, I agree with you 100%, but it also, I mean, it's quite intentional. It's quite ideological. There's a kind of element of propaganda here, obviously. I mean, this individual is far too intelligent, obviously, and you said Sam Harris as well, to not realize these aspects, right? I mean, there was a popular uprising that, gave us the 8-hour workday, that gave us, Social Security, that gave us the minimum wage, all these things that kind of tamed the rapacious capitalism that existed in this country. And that's been all taken away. So for them to not know that and to really not have a sense of that, it's just avoidance of it. I think that's intentional, I think, in this analysis. I don't think they don't know it. I think by not discussing it and bringing it to light again, it just never happened, So it's just the agency of the elites again who make everything happen, or when I hear this again, it's like this kind of, there's a saying in like feudalism, noblesse oblige, like the nobility, decides to go ahead and do something because it's the benefit of the people. And, it comes from this, this desire to help the poor, the people, and somehow, and without that, nothing's going to happen. But I have to say, I don't know what Brett and Aaron think about that, but I just feel like it's got to be intentional in a way.
It is. I think it's and that's kind of the common thread of this whole episode, is this presupposition that the ultra rich, the ultra wealthy, and the elite are kind of, they're presupposed. I mean, they exist, and that they're ultimately a force for good if they choose to use that for good, right? They should be allowed to control the distribution of their wealth through philanthropy. We should not be using taxation and democracy to kind of dictate how these massive quantities of wealth that they have hoarded should be used. Like, they get to pick and choose the philanthropies they want to contribute to, and that's good. I mean, they're captains of industry, and they're fully qualified to do that. So I agree. I think it is kind of deliberate because, to your point, Kevin, they really kind of do edge up to the point many times and then just back away right at the very end. Like, that's as close as they get in this episode to talking about material conditions, like, oh, well, people don't care about the ultra rich. They just care that their material conditions are not improving. It's like, I think it's kind of both. I mean, right? Like, it can be both. You can be really upset that people are hoarding insane amounts of wealth that you should be entitled to. And they kind of touch on that, yeah, things have changed in the last 100 years, where it used to be kind of, that wealth used to come from manufacturing and making at least tangible products that improve society, to where it's now largely financial and digital, to where these people can accumulate these massive troves of wealth without really producing anything of quantifiable value. So yeah, it's the analysis is not entirely wrong, but it's grossly incomplete.
Yeah, I'm almost, when thinking about intention, like, I've been reading a lot of psychoanalysis lately, so I almost want to make a point about the unconscious and the conscious, because there's something here that's like, do I think that they're both saying, okay, we know the answer and we're explicitly hiding it? No, but I know that something in their unconscious is preventing them from taking the analysis to the next level, because they know it would immediately undermine their own interests financially and economically and their entire worldview. And I think that's present in liberalism. It's almost pathologically present in most liberals at this point, specifically with the contradiction so heightened. But, one of the illogical aspects of this was, He says this is not about wealth inequality, but then he goes on to just name downstream effects of wealth inequality, right? Income, opportunity. Yeah, we don't have income because a certain class has it all. We don't have life opportunities because it costs $100,000 to get a bachelor's degree, and even that will still put you in as a barista or a dishwasher in this service economy. So the very thing that they're trying to say, well, it's not really wealth equality, but you're just naming things that happen because there's so much wealth inequality. And the reinvestment in society, whether their own conscious choice of the elites or by government taxation policy, would be a reduction in wealth inequality, right? It would be taking money from people who have too much of it and giving it to people who don't have enough of it. Another aspect, which I think some of you touched on, maybe it was Kevin, wherever there is wealth inequality, there will inevitably be almost proportionately political inequality. Once you have the means in a capitalist society to have a disproportionate amount of that wealth, it will immediately be turned, especially in a corrupt system that is bred under capitalism, to buy off politicians in order to advance your interest and increase that wealth inequality. So those two things really can never be separated. And I think throughout history, those things have never been separated. And then the last thing I would say, they mentioned consumer goods, the cost of consumer goods coming down, like TVs, automobiles have gotten cheaper, but healthcare, education, and everything else have gotten worse. Well, that's a consequence of neoliberalism. That's a consequence of globalization. That's a consequence of capital having no borders, but labor having strict militarized borders. So capital can go and exploit cheap pools of labor in the global south, make commodities for very, very cheap to increase their profit margins and sell it back to the first world, where those jobs used to be here to support, middle class union lives, etc. There's also the devastation of unions, which was a conscious project of the neoliberal era. Reagan and Thatcher both simultaneously formally introduced this need to destroy unions as a response to the falling rate of profit that capitalism was facing through the 60s and 70s. So again, at the very edge of this analysis is the insight, but for whatever reason, conscious, subconscious, or somewhere in between, that last step is just never taken. And that just makes this analysis a joke. It makes it illogical, it makes it elementary, and it makes it sort of dismissible out of hand as not a serious engagement with reality and the ideas on the table.
Right. And I think the funny thing is too, that there is this kind of back and forth in this particular conversation, which is, I think, indicative of two, well-off elites talking to each other, liberal elites talking to each other. Like that I think is embodied by this next clip, which I literally had to like go back and listen to this again because I couldn't fucking believe that he actually like said this.
I think if people feel they haven't made it, even when they have $1 billion on some level, and they're keeping score with reference to the people who have 10 or 100-fold more resources than they do, it either erodes good norms we used to have. I'm not, you can educate me on this point. I'm not sure how much we used to have them, or at least it prevents the formation of norms that we should have, which is people should see that one of the main reasons to be wealthy is to be able to help other people and produce the kind of society that we all want to live in, right? And not to allow that kind of abundance to become just a magnifying glass for the light of self-concern to be even more concentrated.
What the fuck? Like, the point of being wealthy is to do good. Like, I have never, ever, ever, ever heard anyone tell me that they wanted to be rich so that they could do good things. Like, what? Like, no, people want to get wealthy so that they don't have to struggle. Like, and so that they could do whatever they want. Because every one of us knows that we live in a society that money is the means to do what you want. And enough money means liberation from the struggle. And so everyone seeks more money to get liberated from the alienated lifestyle, from being a proletarian. And so the idea that anyone is looking to like make a bunch of money, especially via business ownership and like the extraction of wealth for other people, so that they could immediately turn around and do good, like it flies in the face of obvious reality. And they do talk about this later in the episode too, but like even philanthropic campaigns are like, come on, everybody who's like 100 billionaire, like come on, you guys, give 100 billion away because like 100 billion is a fucking insane amount of money and you don't need it. So like, make sure you give it away. And a bunch of them are like, fuck that. Like, it's my money. I made it. I can do whatever I want with it. You know, there is that ethos. And it's like, it's not, there's no one who thinks, you know what, I want to get rich so that I can do good. And even if they do have that perspective, it completely obscures the way in which you're going to make that wealth. Like, so oh yeah, look, I'm going to exploit the shit out of as many people as I possibly can so that I can accrue a huge amount of money so that I can go around and help the certain group that I want. The fuck? Like, that's not doing good. That's being a dick, and that's it. Just being a dick. And so like this whole notion, like it's frustrating because you hear like people are pissed off about their conditions and everything is good, but like people are just trying to get wealthy because they want to do good. So how do we understand what's going on? It's like, come on, Sam, you're fucking smarter than that. It really, like, it just seems so out of touch and so not the kind of person that you hear in other aspects of even this conversation. But in terms of Sam Harris, it just that seems not unconscious, but consciously like obscuring the point.
Well, I would say there are two parts of that, right? So to your point about people don't become wealthy to distribute it and do good, I think it's antithetical because to hoard, again, it's important that people understand what we now consider like the ultra rich, like the elites and the wealthy. Having $1 billion, having 10 billion or $100 billion, these are not numbers that we normally deal with. And I do want to relay a good analogy that I find is really helpful to kind of convey how different these amounts are, right? So like 1 million seconds ago, 1 million seconds ago is last week. 1 billion seconds ago is 1989. And 100 billion seconds ago is like 1200 AD, right? So like that is a scale, that is a difference in scale that people just don't think about. Like you think about the difference between $1 and $100, you're like, well, okay, I can quantify those. I can kind of figure out what that difference is. And so the difference between 1 billion and 100 billion is roughly the same, but it's just not. The amount of wealth that you are accumulating is like, it's antisocial, it's sociopathic behavior to hoard these resources. You do not have a philanthropic soul if your goal is to become this obscenely rich to hoard this amount of resources. It is, I mean, in my estimation, it's essentially a mental illness. It is sociopathic antisocial behavior. So the people that do want to become wealthy to secure a good life for themselves while also trying to do some good will never achieve those levels of wealth because it's impossible to do so without exploitation, without systemic exploitation of whatever it is you're doing. You cannot extract that much value out of any endeavor without exploiting people along the way, whether it's society through, neglecting to pay taxes, or whether it's your employees by making them pee in jars while you fucking become the richest person in the world. Like you just, the two are fundamentally incompatible. You can't become that rich and still have the good intentions for society at large.
And even if you go into it, like the process itself will turn you into Scrooge, like like you might even say like, I just want to get rich so that I can give money away. But boy, once you get that $1 billion, then you become like the guy in Silicon Valley, who just like only wants to become the billionaire and comes out with like Trace Commas tequila and stuff because all that matters is having the $1 billion and being in the club, like whatever goals you had about what you were going to do with that wealth go out the window as soon as you entered the club, because then, despite what differences there are, as you mentioned, Brett, within the bourgeoisie, especially the high bourgeoisie, there's still a recognition that like, well, we're not, we're all on the same team. We might have ideas of whether Trump really represents us or Biden really represents us, but like the question is who's going to represent us? We all know who us means. The bourgeoisie has a class consciousness that the proletariat needs very desperately, and I think did have to a degree that it definitely doesn't now. Partially because the institutions of proletarian solidarity were destroyed by the very people whose goal it was to make the money, because the unions were getting in the way of making those $100 billion. It's why wealth inequality has never actually been higher, because you've destroyed the union movement when you know, 100 years ago, the union movement was rising. You know, it's a different day.
Yeah, definitely. You know, there is no moral way to become a billionaire, right? In order to become a billionaire, you spend years and years exploiting people, extracting resources from other people, you know, shoving people around in your own sort of competitive marketplace, trying to, especially if you're of a company that has shareholders, your entire job as a leader of that would be to increase profit margins for your shareholders. No moral dimension comes into it all. All the years and energy and lifetime that you spend becoming a billionaire, if you spent that instead just agitating inside of a union, trying to form a union, you would do inexorably more good for the people around you and their kids and their families by raising their living standards than the billionaire who extracts ruthlessly profit from those people by destroying those unions, by decreasing their quality of life, etc. Jeff Bezos, right? And you cannot separate Jeff Bezos' wealth from the abjectly horrific conditions that his workers are forced to operate in every single day. Those two things are part and parcel. They cannot be separated, no matter how much the liberal would love to separate those two things and pretend that there could be, you know, some bridge there. And then, yeah, the justification, like it's a justification you'll hear from rich people, like, you know, yes, I like to be successful, blah, blah, blah. I also want to have money because then I can help people more efficiently. But that's sort of a fog that is like a post hoc justification because you want to feel like a good person. And so, you know, you're looking at yourself in a radically unequal society with way too much money, more money than you or your kids will ever need. And it behooves the consciousness of somebody that's not a psychopath to be like, you know what, I really want to be good. And that's part of the reason I did this in the first place, is to help other people. And then it goes into, I'm a job creator. And if it wasn't for me, all these people wouldn't have jobs in the first place. So I really am a good person. And it's like, okay, who are you trying to convince here? And then the very last thing I would say is this does go back to Sam's childhood, because that perspective can only come from somebody who has never had to grind it out in the 9 to 5, who's never had to drive for Uber and work a second job or wash dishes in the back of a kitchen, because that whole idea would just never enter your mind. And as you said, Kevin, it's you want to get the fuck out of the rat race by any means necessary. You don't want to suffer every single day and slaughter 2/3 of your waking life on the altar of somebody else's profit margins. But Sam's never had to go through that. And then he's also intellectually interested in, like, you know, moral philosophy and all the altruism movement, etc. So then he just like combines these things and says, well, that must be why people want to become rich. You know, I've never had to work, so I don't know the perspective of somebody grinding it out. I'm interested in moral philosophy and doing good. I'm going to project those things onto entire systems and countless people's psychologies. It's an illogical move, and it's like, yeah, it's pathological that Sam can't see what he's doing there.
Yeah. Cinar, you got anything?
Not really. I don't have much to add to those 2 points. I mean, that's fantastic, basically. I mean, really, you know, but also, you know, these individuals are compelled to actually, you know, to valorize capital, gain more money through this process, because if they don't do it, there's competition, right? So somebody's going to take their place. So they're always looking behind their backs, basically, as who's up there, you know, who's gonna take their place. So that drives them into further kind of situations of exploitation, further usurpation of workers, further, you know, externalities to the environment, the community, what have you, in order to get that position. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I really don't have much to add to it. I think it's just odd. There's this theme that runs through this whole kind of discussion of where I think these individuals are trying to really just basically justify this elitist point of history with a kind of blatant disregard of all these other factors of social movements that's happened. So yeah, not much to add on that point.
I just the best part, the one of two things I always love is the protecting of conscience that people do by saying, oh, it's only business, right? It's not personal, you guys. This is a business decision. Like, I have a fiduciary duty. There's nothing I can do about it. So, like, you got to take the morals out of it, man. I'm going to stab you in the fucking back, but, like, let's go out for a drink because, like, it's just business. It's just a game. It's, of course, like, our lives and our ability to, like, afford our houses and afford food and, like, all the things that you need to live. But, like, it's just a game. And then the other one being, like, well, you know, if I didn't do it, because, like, yeah, I'm not perfect. And, like, yeah, I guess I'm exploiting people. But, like, if I didn't do it, somebody who was like way worse and more ruthless than me would be doing it. So like, it's better that I get all this money because like I'll give some of it away, but like some ruthless asshole that's way worse than me could just like take it all. So like I gotta protect my position. And if that means I gotta, increase quarterly profits, I'm gonna do it. Like there's a lot of protecting your conscience that are going on. So, but in this conversation, that we have this like sort of dance back and forth between like sort of bad analysis, then getting close to something that sounds right, then hearing that the point of wealth is to do good. But then what sounds to me like a kind of call for social democracy in this next clip. So here, let's listen to this.
And today, I think Joe Biden actually believes in the ideal of public service. He is more interested in making 350 million Americans better off than making himself better off. That has diminishing returns for him, but he will go to his grave delightfully happy if he has made all Americans better off. Now, that's an old school ideal. I'm glad it's back in the presidency in the United States, and I hope it can spread. But that's what successful societies, frankly, rely on. If the richest and most powerful turn their backs on public welfare, then democracy doesn't make sense for people anymore, because why should they vote for a government that ignores them and that concentrates its benefits on the rich? So if we want to restore and rejuvenate democracy, we need governments that function to provide broad general benefits again, not that simply exist to help those who have the best positions or the most capital get even further ahead.
What has prevented that kind of government from coming into existence? Like, which is the logical next question. Like, well, yeah, that sounds great. A government that serves the people and that is actually like geared towards the public good. Why don't we have that kind of government? Well, wealth inequality isn't the big problem, guys. It's all kinds of other inequality, right? Like, so it's like there's this call for like social democracy with the recognition that every movement towards social democracy, like most evidently in the United States, has come up against massive opposition and inevitable rollback, to where to me it's even surprising that we still have Social Security, because almost everything else in the New Deal is gone, besides what's left of unemployment, the joke that is minimum wage, and Social Security that doesn't pay for anybody, and you got to invest your money in the stock market because you can't trust Social Security. Like this again is just kind of, it's like you're so close to understanding what it is that we need, but you have this piss poor analysis of why we don't have that thing. And from Sam, you don't hear this. Well, isn't the problem that we have a bunch of rich people who buy senators and buy members of Congress? Like, isn't that the fundamental problem? No. It's the fact that those elites aren't buying members of Congress to do good, that they're somehow buying members of Congress to serve them. Like, what's the point of buying somebody if they're not going to serve your interests? It just seems, again, another strange thing to not point out. It seems so obvious that, again, it goes back to, is this really unconscious or is this intentional?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. In fact, before you said that, I wrote down, why doesn't the government function? Because you're right. That's the next logical question. Why does it only serve a certain small segment of the ruling elite? That's the next question to ask for anybody that's even partially intellectually engaged in this conversation. It just stops right there. But I think a primary liberal delusion at play specifically in this part, but throughout this entire conversation, is the idea that the state is neutral. Without a class analysis of the state under capitalism, you can get these sort of confused ideas where it's just like, well, Biden's personal morality will come into play and give us the system we want, because fundamentally the state is neutral. It's a mediator of different interest groups. And so as long as we get a good person or good people into the state, it can do good things. And that is a flaw that comes with not understanding the class basis of the state. And that's, of course, something that's missing with all liberals, but particularly, Sam Harris and Jack Goldstone. And so that feeds into a whole bunch of other poor analysis. They can't understand the problem. They definitely can't really lay out a vision for the solution. They might have inklings of what the solution might look like, but how would you actually get it? And that is because they have that liberal view that the state is a neutral entity.
Yeah. I mean, who did, like, Who does the state serve? And you look at the history of the United States since, I don't care, pick your date, really. And it's pretty clear that the government has never really been in the interest of serving the needs of the masses of people. Because, like, even in the New Deal, right? The only reason we got the New Deal reforms we did was from massive pressure from below, to the point that, like, it was basically revolution or New Deal reforms. And that's the point that gets you in, like, towards any kind of social democratic moves. But then, of course, even those were not nearly what was necessary and didn't get us national health care and what other sort of social democracies give. And so, like, that is a significant, like, liberal kind of standard political science notion that, like, the state is just a mediator of interests, and it's not. It's bought for. It serves the interests of the elite, and the only time it ever does, like, help the worst off is only to stave off the potential destruction of the state apparatus. And so it's another misunderstanding. It's like this elite perspective is not able to account for the kind of situation that we actually live in. Like, it doesn't match, and so it has very little value.
Yeah, I would just add. Oh, go ahead.
No, just really quickly, yeah, and it's almost as if, the state is somewhat independent, basically, of these centers of wealth and concentration, right? So there's a primacy of the state that's going to make all these changes. Somehow the elite is associated with that, without, kind of tying that back into the concentration of wealth that you have amongst the elites themselves, and then how that's defining policy in this country. So, or around the world, especially under this, a program of neoliberalism, which has actually created tremendous amounts of inequality and concentration of capital and wealth over the last 40 years. Yeah, so it's a complete disregard of that. Again, I don't know. I think it sounds a little bit more conscious, because it just seems so blatant to me that they're really talking around the issues. There must have a sense of really what's going on. But again, it's, liberals are deluded to the point where they really don't see these issues, and they can't see it for what they are, and they have actually effectively really erased the history, the progressive history that existed in this country that you were talking about, Kevin, that really made these changes, that affected that change in government and policy through organization, through unionization, through all the agitation that happened through a lot of the working class in this country. So yeah, I mean, it's denial, or intentional kind of denial at best. Yeah.
I really want to send him a copy of People's History of the United States. Like, come on, dude, like, read what is pretty standard, historical fare. And I think what happens with this notion of, like, the state just needs to serve the interests of the masses, and it just needs to orient, and not understanding the class nature and the role of the state and those things gets especially liberals bogged down in policy wonk kind of discussions. And I mean, having gone to, like, law school in Washington, D.C., this was like the world that everyone lived in, between that and, like, really odd and somewhat strange forms of identity politics. This like wonkish focus on individual policies. This, like, that's when the savior looks like Elizabeth Warren, because it's just like, I got a plan for that, and I got a plan for this. Like, all I got to do is shift bankruptcy policy in one little way, and it's going to make all the difference. And this happens in this conversation, where there's like, yeah, the state needs to do something different. So what we really need to talk about is taxes, because the issue is just sort of non-fair taxation. And so they talk about what at least Goldstone presents his idea of what fair taxation would be. So let's listen to that.
Where I want to land here in this conversation is with some sense of what we think we should do going forward. I mean, it seems like we have, massive problems to solve, many of which are only exacerbating the problem we're talking about. I mean, we have to deal with the COVID pandemic, obviously, but the COVID pandemic has ramified and worsened various forms of inequality in our society. Certainly, wealth is one, and I guess, and we've begun this conversation framing it in terms of of what the most fortunate people decide to do, essentially, what we've put it in terms of philanthropy and charity, but really the other piece here is our tax code and the willingness or disinclination of rich people to pay what we might think is their fair share or more in taxes, and the degree to which they're going to fight any attempt to raise taxes. How do you view taxation here and any specific strategies we might use to redistribute wealth? Here's what I think the psychological status quo is here among fortunate, wealthy people at every level.
Status quo.
There's a sense that, rather often the government is terrible at what it attempts to do, right? There's a basic cynicism that the government can ever do anything especially well. And therefore,
tax cuts.
You tend to encounter rich people who think that that this offers some argument for not paying more in taxes because the money will be wasted or spent on some boondoggle. Whereas in my view, that it's really that's an argument for better governance. By all means, point out all the ways in which government fails and is wasteful, but that's not an argument at where you want to set the tax code. It's an argument for better government. But there's a sense that taxes are already too high. You run into this with disconcerting frequency among rich people, and therefore it's only rational to want to decide to give the money to the most effective causes oneself rather than have the government waste it. So this explains a bias for philanthropy over taxation. But as we know, people aren't all that generous when they don't have to be, or at least most of them are not. And so the amount that people actually give away, even when it's well publicized, is a rounding error on a rounding error of their wealth rather often. And it's certainly not what they would be obliged to give away if we raised taxes on them. So how do you view taxation here? And feel free to get into any specific ideas about how to change our tax code.
See, and just before they start, that all sounds fine, right? There is an idea behind rich people that the government can't spend money well, and so I shouldn't have to pay for it, and I'll just I'll direct it in the way that I want to. It misses the point that part, a significant reason that people are doing that is for the purposes of avoiding taxes. So, the social engineering that's been done in the United States via the tax code, via, exemptions and all kinds of weird things in the tax code, means that people are incentivized to do philanthropy so that they can avoid taxes. But of course, philanthropy or philanthropic giving can be in the form of Trump to the Trump organization, right? It's just this bias towards philanthropy is really just a bias towards shifting your money around so that the government can't get your hands on it, so that you can still have access to direct it in whatever way that you want. It's not it's the prevention of good governance. That's the damn frustrating thing that I hear there is oh, well, it just means that we need better government. Well, the misallocation of resources and the bad government that's associated with it is because you've got these people with money. Make the fucking connection, Sam. Anyway, okay, let's listen to Goldstein's response.
Thank you for that invitation. Most people would like to tear up the existing tax code and start over. But let me say, from the point of view of my model, there are actually three things that need to be kept in mind as we try and pull our society back from the edge of extreme conflict and decay. One is restoring people's trust that government can function and can solve problems. The days when we looked to government to provide the interstate highway system, to build beautiful airports, to build subways to take us to work, to provide law and order, to provide for the national defense, to send rockets to the moon, to develop new cures for disease. All of these things we trusted government to do reasonably well, and we thought they were prudent investments for the future. But as you say, too many people now think that any dollar spent by government is wasted, and therefore even a dollar spent on a ultra-premium whiskey for one person's consumption is still better than letting that money be wasted by the government. So that philosophy has to change. We have to say, look, there are legitimate things that government can do. And you know what? When there's a disaster, when even a rich person's land gets flooded or a tornado comes, they come to the government and say, what about restoring my property? What about fixing this? And so on. So government has to be seen as having a valid role in a complex, wealthy society. There are big problems. COVID-19, obviously, a huge one that's hitting us in the face. But so too is climate change, as the Midwest is flooding and the California is burning and the Gulf Coast is being battered by repeated powerful hurricanes. We can't allow those things to double or triple and expect that quality of life will go on. So you're right. People have to recover a trust that government is worth funding. Otherwise, everyone fights taxation. The second thing is that elites have to work together to find some common ground in what needs to be done to strengthen and improve society, as opposed to just being in competing camps saying, this is what our group needs to do, and we don't want you to be involved, and vice versa. If you have Republicans and Democrats or Tories and socialists, whatever your division.
There it was. There was the one mention of socialist in the entire podcast episode. There it was. Oh, if you have Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and socialists, it doesn't matter.
Are, if instead of saying, yes, of course we have differences, we're human beings, but because we're human, we have some common needs and interests and we have to work hard to find them. If you put that task aside and just say, I want my group to win, we go back on the path toward, I'm not going to raise anyone's taxes because you might spend them on things that you want, and I think that's awful. And the other group will say, well, we're not going to raise taxes because you might spend it on things that you want. And instead of saying, let's have an agenda for things that we agree we need, and then find a level of taxation that allows us to accomplish what is necessary. So you need to have government that's trusted. You need to have elites that work together. And then the third thing is you need people to feel the system is fair, that the taxes that they pay are not unfair compared to the taxes that others, especially the rich, pay. I mean, one of the big problems we have with the tax system now is not the rate of taxation, but the fact that so many assets and so much income escapes taxation altogether. It's in offshore LLCs. It's in real estate trusts. It's in exempt inheritance trusts. All of these things make the system unfair and give people a general hatred of taxation as just something else that's rigged. So we need to go back to fair enforcement, clear and understandable laws, and a system that people believe in.
I've been called, because I, have called myself a socialist, a communist, and a Marxist. I've been called a utopian many times in my life. There is, to me, nothing more utopian than what we just heard. That, things just need to change. And the way things just need to change so that people think the government works is that elites need to get together and make the government work. Like, what I don't understand, and what this analysis totally neglects to understand, is that if you're a wealthy person, the government works fine. The government works just fine for you. It gives you all the tax breaks it needs. It makes sure that utilities and all the things are covered in your area. Your the enclaves in which you live are fully available to any government amenities. Like, it's cool. But if you don't have access to that kind of wealth, the government doesn't work very well. And so this weird notion that rich people will say, well, the government doesn't work very well for poor people. Therefore, I shouldn't give it any money because it's going to waste its money. Like, neglect, totally, and it is this pervasive idea, because it is, and maybe back to the psychoanalysis, there's this weird notion in rich people's heads that I know that it works well for me, but it's sort of not supposed to really work well for me because I'm doing really well, and it's supposed to work for the people who aren't doing well, but it doesn't do that very well. So therefore, I have no obligation to participate in its failure. This all doesn't make sense to me, and it is again just another representation of the poverty of the analysis, that the issue that we really have is somehow a belief in the government, that if people believed the government, and the government built subways and airports and the interstate highway system when income taxes were 90%, when business taxes were like 50%, where businesses were paying the majority of income taxes, where it wasn't like you change income tax and the amount of money the government gets, and yep, it does a shittier job of providing services because it doesn't have the fucking money, like, so what's the solution? Well, making people pay their fair share, which for rich people is a fucking lot of money. Like, you should be giving away a majority of your money. If you've got $1 billion, if you got $1 billion, you don't need $1 billion. You could probably get away with $10 million. So give us the 910 million other dollars. Is that the math? I don't know. Whatever. But like, give us the rest of the fucking money because you don't need it. It's like 990. Damn, I suck at math. That's why I went into law school. But yeah, like, for real, like, the idea that you don't make the correlation between the limited ability of the government to do things because of its lack of capital resources, its lack of financial resources, and the belief that the government can't do anything. Like, these things are interrelated in a way that makes that paints a perfectly, like, easily understood picture by like anyone. To not make that is, again, why should we take this fucker seriously about anything? Like, Sam Harris is not being educated. He's being bullshitted.
I would agree. I mean, I think Sam is very generous with his guests, from what I've heard. I mean, I think he basically just kind of lets them drive and doesn't really offer a lot of pushback. But it's problematic because, as you said, he appears to, he always kind of leads him to a point, but then lets him completely refute it. And in this case, it is a dismissal of the root causes of why government is so inefficient. It's because it has been, systematically dismantled. It's been defunded and it's been dismantled in order to promote privatization by the people that have money and power now, and they want to eliminate the post office and turn it over to private sector. So they've instituted all of these rules that further bankrupt the postal service, and that's why it's kind of shitty now. And it's not shitty; it's an amazing system, but compared to the efficiency of private enterprise, it's got problems. So they never really delve into that. They never really delve into why the system is so flawed and so broken. And they do flounder on that. They kind of talk about how, the wealthy have insulated themselves from these problems by building their own kind of parallel structures where they don't have to deal with the issues. But then they talk about, if they would just pay in and we would all just drop the class consciousness and we all come together and sing Kumbaya and let the elites lead us where we need to go. Like, it's just, it's shallow analysis at best. It's naive, is probably the most accurate way that you can describe it.
Yeah, I mean, at its worst, it's a Nazi idea. Like, let's get rid of these like class divisions. Let's all just kind of get together so that we can serve the general interests of like our people. Like, that's a very fascistic way of thinking about things.
And I also think this kind of insistence on philanthropy, I mean, it's fundamentally anti-democratic, right? I mean, in a democracy, you pay your taxes, you pay for the services that you want to see in society that are going to help people out. By not doing that and going towards philanthropy again, it's quite fundamentally anti-democratic. So that's the argument he's making at the end of the day. The elite or whoever, basically, they know what's right, and they'll give their money in that direction, basically. And we know at the end of the day what that's going to be. It's going to serve their own interests. We're going to help valorize their own, businesses or whatever, their capital accumulation or whatever it's going to be. It's going to serve their own interests. So it's a very anti-democratic kind of argument that they make. And also, this issue about the efficiency of government, this is a very tired kind of inefficiency of government. This is a very tired argument, right? Because ostensibly government could be democratic, right? At the end of the day, if you had equitable distribution of wealth, if you had people participating actively in an economy where there's less inequality and people are paying into the system. So in those situations, and Aaron was talking about this, you had great efficiencies in government, right? You had great efficiencies in the post office, great efficient Social Security, if you think about it. It's a super efficient system at the end of the day, and many other things. But it's this old argument, about basically the inefficiency of government. Why do we have these inefficiencies? Obviously, so that the elite don't have to pay for it. and maybe we could do better actually, and they can just decide to give to whatever causes they think is best for society at large. So yeah, it's fundamentally kind of flawed, and there's a lot, this intentional, and I'm calling it intentional, not focusing on kind of concentration of wealth and its impact throughout society, I think is just a massive flaw in the analysis.
Yeah. I really like your point about it being an anti-democratic point and an anti-democratic conversation. Democracy is not just political democracy, like everybody gets to vote every 4 years for their favorite rich guy. Real democracy, and the solution to so many of the problems that they bring up, is people having a meaningful say in their workplace, in their economy, and in how their daily lives are structured. That would be a radical reorienting of all of society to push out the need to worry about the psychological and moral impulses of a small group of the elite. The fact that the entire conversation is centered on that is inherently anti-democratic, and it shows that doesn't even enter their minds, that the rest of us are fucking people with families, and maybe we'd like to have a little say in how our daily lives are structured, how our economy functions, how our workplace is. Every time you walk into the workplace, you walk into a dictatorship. So I think that's a great point that is really important to emphasize. And then the whole ideology that pours out of the sort of libertarian worldview of like the hatred of government, the distrust of government. This is in part, stuff that just bubbles up in a capitalist culture, but it's also a direct result of Reagan ideology, of Reaganite, Reagan era neoliberal ideology. What did Reagan say? The scariest thing that you could ever hear is the phrase, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Now, that was an ideological apparatus that was erected around a shift in capitalist policy, as I mentioned earlier. But that ideology trickles down and is the result and simultaneous to the gutting of government, which makes it not work in the first place. And the Republican Party today, although there is some stirrings as to what direction they'll go in now, I mean, they're anti-government. They're not interested in governing properly. They're not interested in any vision or any solutions to politics. They're interested in grievance and making government not work so they can point at it and say, let's privatize it because it doesn't work in the first place. And so, that would at least maybe be brought up in this conversation. I don't know. It'd be worthwhile to think about that. And then the last thing I would say, just as a sort of meta perspective, well, two things is he says the elites need to work together. This system is a result of the elites working together. Working people need to work together now. The working people need to come together and work together. But secondly is, Marxist analysis demystifies these problems. It's a point in favor of the superiority of Marxist analysis that all four of us can sit here, take what they're saying, extrapolate on it, point to the logical conclusions, and make sense of the problems that they're still wrestling with. That shows that maybe Marxism isn't the end-all be-all of all forms of analysis, but it's superior in every way to the liberal analysis precisely because it demystifies what liberalism can't demystify. And this conversation they're having proves their inability to demystify. And I think we're doing a good job showing our ability to do that. So it's just worth pointing out.
For sure. Yeah, we're kicking ass, man. Okay, so I think that's a perfect segue into the next like two or three things, because there is it kind of is laughable to the degree that Sam Harris is confused by this, and to some of the things that he kind of says, and I think it's like speaks to the failure of his the kind of idealism that he takes. But so let's listen to an example here.
What is the impediment to our making more or less instantaneous progress on this front? I mean, when you cite specific examples like the fact that Apple, the most valuable, I believe it's the most valuable corporation on earth right now, is being run essentially from a P.O. box in Ireland because it doesn't want to pay U.S. corporate taxes. I mean, that is an example of tax evasion so transparent and obscene that it seems like a single New York Times article about it should be enough to accomplish a change in policy, right? And you take someone like, Warren Buffett saying, I don't see why I pay a lower tax rate than my secretary does, right? That doesn't make any sense to me. Come tax me more. Right. Why wasn't that single utterance sufficient to produce some kind of reckoning here? Because It makes absolutely no sense. I mean, and what you just said about capital gains in California, yeah, yes, there's a lot of capital gains in California to be taxed, but as you just pointed out, the tax rate for capital gains is exactly what explains Warren Buffett's mystification. Why is he taxed at a small fraction of what ordinary income is taxed at? What is actually blocking us on these points?
So, like, to me, again, this is like just laughable in the sense that, like, why wasn't that single utterance by Warren Buffett enough to make this monumental change in the way that, like, the elites, the bourgeoisie, and kind of in general everybody thinks about government and taxation and stuff like that? Like, why isn't someone's statement, as true as it may be, not enough to change social policy? Like, if there ever was a failure, like the example of the as you were saying, Brett, the sort of hierarchy between a materialist perspective and an idealist perspective, it's that. Like, it's obvious I think to most people, honestly, the most people who aren't committed to idealism in the way that Sam Harris is, why a single utterance by Warren Buffett wasn't enough, or a single New York Times article, right? No, but not everybody reads the New York fucking Times, Sam. So, like, not everybody would hear that message. But at the same time, like, because ideas don't change social policy, like movements do. And if you don't understand that, then yes, this is all really confusing to you, because people just are swayed only by ideas. Ideas are all that matter. And so why aren't ideas changing things? Like, maybe because ideas don't do that, Sam. You're wrong. And that perspective is wrong. And it's making you come to some really nonsensical, laughable, and illogical conclusions. And so as a smart dude, this is like my direct message to Sam Harris, dude, as a smart guy, you should know better, and you should recognize, and you should really like take a course in idealism versus materialism. Take a course in 19th century German philosophy, and come out of that. I mean, you did a PhD in neuroscience, dude. You could take this class, and I bet you'd come out of it with a much different perspective. Because damn, dude, you're saying some stupid shit. So that's how I feel about that. You guys can riff on that.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that clip, like pretty much the rest of the conversation that they have, just highlights that. Like, they keep trying to diagnose the symptoms without ever really looking for the kind of cohesive root cause behind all of it. Like you said, when you look at everything through this kind of neoliberal lens, and that's all you see, you cannot see past the boundaries of it. And so that's why, like Brett said, like it keeps mystifying them. They can't go beyond these bounds. And so all of their diagnosis is of these particular symptoms, like, well, if we just reform the tax code, everything would be fine. Or if the elites who are entitled to all of their stolen wealth would just come together and, work in favor of society, everything would be great. Like, you're not zooming out enough to kind of see it. And to your point, Kevin, I mean, the fact that he does have a kind of a clinical background, a scientific background, he is so scientifically minded generally. It's bizarre that he just never really seems to try to stray outside of this framework that dictates his entire worldview and kind of the path that his philosophy goes in. It's just bizarre. It's a strange limitation. It's a very huge blind spot, but it's very limiting.
Yeah.
He thinks rationality is simultaneous and synonymous with his political beliefs. Like, to be objective is simply to be a liberal centrist. There's no need then, if that's your assumption, to go outside of liberal centrism, because the further away you get from it, the more irrational you get. And that's part of how he thinks. And that's a huge, obviously, detriment to his thinking. But, Kevin mentioned that socialism is only mentioned in passing once in this conversation. I could be wrong, but I haven't heard the word capitalism mentioned, which seems like maybe, and that's he talks about at some point, Sam Harris says, something wrong with the system. It's not just psychological. Well, name that system, and capitalism is on the tip of your tongue. And the fact that that's not mentioned at all is sort of like the irony in economics department, where you can get a bachelor's degree in economics in most universities and never have to come across the term capitalism as a system because it takes it for granted. And I think you're seeing that same thing replicated here. And the last thing I would say is this dissonance, this the feeling of what America should be versus what it actually is. Well, with the pandemic and the crisis of neoliberalism, it's getting further and further and further away, making the ideological jump harder and harder to make for all sides of the political spectrum, for liberals and conservatives. And we see this is what happens when liberals, smart liberals, try to bridge that gap. Their analysis flounders. They can't quite grasp at the nuances, and they can't make that jump to conclusions that are coherent. On the right, because there's, for many reasons, that produces in part conspiracy thinking, because the right has a lot of the liberal ideas, but like even more romanticized, like America's the greatest country in the world. We're number one. God chose us to be the best country in the world. Capitalism is synonymous with freedom. Therefore, when that system begins to falter and that bridge gets further and further away, for the conservative mind, that's even a more radical jump to make. They can't make sense of it. Diving into conspiracy theories is one way to deal with that cognitive dissonance. So the danger we're seeing on the right is reflected in a subtler way here in this liberal conversation, and neither of them, can ever lead us out of these problems. That's becoming increasingly clear.
Yeah, the problem isn't that there's a global economic system that extracts wealth from people. It's this underground democratic pedophile ring and then the giant space dreidel laser that's having, that's really the things that we need to focus on, because the system works, right? It's just we have to make sure that we add some word to the beginning of it, like crony capitalism or crapitalism, or we call it something else, because like the system is good, but it's got some modifier word that's made it bad. This is what you hear all the time. All right, so we're brushing up on an hour and a half, but there's one more that I want to play that I think for me really, really pissed me off. Like, obviously I haven't been pissed by any of these, right? But I've just been super calm this entire conversation. But this one, when I heard it, which is basically Goldstone's response to why Sam doesn't think there could be instantaneous progress, at kind of what he says at the end, that really, really rubbed me the wrong way. And I think this will be a good way to kind of, let us conclude. But so let's hear. Let me make sure that here we go.
Well, there are two things. Very, practically, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are great philanthropists, and they tried to organize other billionaires into a society of philanthropists where they would compete with each other in philanthropic giving rather than wealth accumulation.
But this comes back to our earlier point that this does sidestep the tax code. This is just making a virtue of being a philanthropist.
But it more or less says, if you're going to be a philanthropist and give much of your wealth to causes you believe in, you don't have to worry about the tax code taking it away from you because you've made the disposition yourself.
Right.
But the thing is, they couldn't get as many billionaires as they had hoped to sign on for the philanthropic community. They just found that most people had adopted a kind of Ayn Rand philosophy that says, I earned it, it's mine. You inferior people who may envy me, keep your hands off what I have earned. And that attitude somehow becomes the new religion. Instead of following Jesus, they follow Ayn Rand and make a virtue out of the accumulation and display of private wealth. Now, as I say, we've been here before. Thorstein Veblen wrote a whole book on how conspicuous consumption and the display of luxury had become part of the American lifestyle and had some good as well as bad aspects. But like anything else, if it becomes too extreme, if it goes to the point, I don't mind if people go to a charity ball and they wear expensive jewelry and show off to each other while doing something good. Of course, people have egos and they want to do that. But if it comes to the point where they say, society has no right to tax what I have earned because I did it myself, and I'm not going to let it be, as Mitt Romney was said to have said, I'm a maker. I'm not going to let society take what I've earned and give it to people who are just takers. Well, if you divide the world that way, the takers are going to come after you because they're going to say, wait a minute, we're the ones who are doing a lot of the labor. We're the ones who are working in the shadow of your plants, or the ones who are being put out of jobs. If you slice up and sell off pieces of our company. We're human beings too. We deserve dignity and respect, and we deserve to be rewarded for our work. And if you just treat us as takers, then, to hell with you and everyone else, and we're going to get a dictator who will destroy everybody, but at least we'll all go down together, and then you'll be equal to us again. That's the impetus behind revolutions throughout history.
I'm fucking, like, it's hard to make me speechless, but Jesus fucking Christ. Like, again, this is like this perfect example of like, yeah, like, we're living the shadows of your factory. We're human beings too. We got problems. So we're going to get a dictator and take you down with us? Like, okay. And one, we've now rehabilitated Mitt Romney, right? Nobody remembers Mitt Romney's makers takers, right? Because he voted against Trump. So like, he's rehabilitated. It's all good. Nothing ever happened. Like, he never went to the gulag. Everything was fine. And then calling it an Ayn Randian philosophy. Oh, very interesting. That again, like you were saying, Brett, you could use another like word, which is capitalist bourgeois ideology, which is what Ayn Randian philosophy is. And it is what the ideology of the bourgeoisie is. They are the makers. They have earned this wealth. There's nothing wrong with how they've earned it. And so they should be able to dispose of it however they want, whether that's funding their own private space program or buying, $1,000 whiskey drinks or whatever. Like, it's their money. That's a pervasive idea, not because of Ayn Rand, like, it's because of the economic system that we live in. And so, like, the idea too that the perspective that Goldstone has is essentially that what the rabble do when the elites don't do their civic duty is all get together and take everybody down. Means to me that his idea is that revolutions are essentially anti-progressive, that revolutions do not move the needle forward, they bring it back. And that's as if you were to, that's like if I listened to Mike Duncan's like 1 million episodes on the French Revolution, I only listened to the 4 about the terror. Like, and I didn't listen to everything else about how much of a change it really was and how much of a destruction of the feudal order that revolution really entailed, and how there was this ebb and flow back and forth because conditions were such that people could take advantage of and move in different directions. Like, the idea that a revolution can be described as we'll all get together and get a dictator to take you down with us is the most infantile, ridiculous, notion of revolutions by the fucking foremost person on revolutions. You gotta be kidding me. It just, like, to me, that like we could have just had this whole conversation based on this one clip, because it's so emblematic of the whole conversation. Just ridiculous back and forth, but so close, like just so close. Yes, Jack, you had it. Like, people are pissed because they're being exploited at their jobs. That exploitation is the reason people are elites. It's what prevents them from making a government that people care about. It's why you're going to have a revolution that doesn't always grab a dictator, but sometimes moves in the directions of increased democratic rights, which is us socialists that you are too scared to talk about genuinely want. All we want is an expansion of democratic rights to where they fucking should be, namely at the workplace, which is not discussed in this episode at all, to Cinar's point. There's no discussion of increasing democracy or there being a democracy deficit, in Yanis Varoufakis' way of putting it. There's none of that. It's that elites aren't doing their job, and if the elites don't do their job, the rabble are going to grab Adolf Hitler, I guess, and take everybody down with them. Fucking ridiculous.
It's the conclusion of the current that we've all been pointing at this entire time, which is this, it betrays this complete locking into the bourgeois perspective as the only perspective, because what he's really saying here, right? We're talking about like a lack of agency for the masses. It's all about the elites. He's saying, drag us down. Everybody is being torn down, right? He means them. Everybody is them, because he really literally doesn't fully see regular working people as beings with agency and lives and goals. It's so centered around the perspective of the elite that from their perspective, a revolution is a tearing down of everything, because that's all that is conceived when he talks about, who has agency, who's important, who should be the focal point of these conversations. And then what you were saying is really important. I think it fundamentally undergirds the materialist perspective, which is the idea that ideas are epiphenomenal, right? They're secondary to material reality. Ayn Randian philosophy does not come before capitalism. It comes out of capitalism. Capitalism is the condition, the necessary and sufficient condition for something like Ayn Randian philosophy to ever come up and exist in the first place. So I have a great idea of how to eliminate Ayn Randian philosophy. Eliminate rich people because it's their philosophy. You create a society where a small amount of people have all the money. There's really, really rich people and really, really poor people. The really, really rich people are going to come up with numerous justifications for why they deserve, and it's actually natural for them to have that wealth. And Ayn Randian is just one particularly vulgar expression of that. But that is the idealist error, is to think that ideas are primary, material reality is secondary. That flips the entire analysis on its head, on its ass, and gets everything backwards.
Yeah. Aaron Cinar, what do you got? Final thoughts?
I mean, honestly, hearing that clip again kind of made it click for me, and to echo what Brett said, is it really made me realize that their perception of it is that, again, the liberal elites are the norm, and the people that are revolting and grabbing a dictator to tear it all down is the lower classes, who I guess are conservative by default because they don't share the same worldview, right? It was essentially, they were, in another part in this conversation, they kind of talked about this socioeconomic discontent being the source of the January 6th events. So it does kind of make it obvious. It makes it kind of clear that they view, the liberal mentality as kind of being the norm and the standard. And anyone who's beneath that is kind of, of the conservative bent who elected Trump to try to burn the system down. And I think it really kind of informs the rest of that worldview. It really shows, again, just how locked in they are to that analysis, to not being able to imagine that there could be a progressive revolution, that there could be, people who have different views in different socioeconomic strata. And it's odd. I mean, like I said, it really kind of clicked for me here, just hearing it again, just how ingrained that perception is for them.
Yeah, and pretty much for me too. I mean, again, I think it was repeated again and again throughout the conversation. I think the agency throughout history is with the elite, and I think the workers, the rest of the population, are just ancillary to that movement in history. And I think that dismissal of them, I think, shows maybe this anti-democratic sentiment that they have that runs throughout this whole kind of conversation. At the end of the day, I think also it's it takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of ability to really skirt this idea of not even mentioning. It's interesting, they mention socialism, but they don't mention capitalism, like Brett said. It's interesting. And I think by not mentioning the system in which we live our lives, in which all of these issues manifest themselves, is a way of just like dismissing it, just saying that it's actually natural and this is something that's going to exist. It's like the air that we breathe at the end of the day. So you don't really have to acknowledge it. So if you don't acknowledge it, then you don't address it. You don't have to address it. So you can just talk around the issue and not talk about the actual issue that's causing this inequality, that's causing this friction that we're seeing within society. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he ends, I think it's basically talking about where we are in the US at the moment right now, and how we are moving towards this more of a polarized kind of society and what that means at the end of the day. But again, there's tremendous discipline to kind of skirt the main issue of really what's causing this polarization and inequality within the US and, quite frankly, across the world.
Yeah, I think this goes, again, just the value of historical materialism. So dialectical is another one that would be helpful in terms of making it not so Anglo-Saxon analytical, which I think Sam Harris is very much in that tradition. But if we just do the historical materialism stuff, this discussion is ahistorical. The guy says, I've looked at revolutions since 1500, but apparently it doesn't matter when these revolutions happen in order to understand them, right? That basically all revolutions are essentially the same kind of phenomenon. It is an ahistorical phenomenon, and it's not even really economic, except for that there's this economic incentive not to care about the common good anymore. And then, it's not even, and the analysis isn't materialist. So it presupposes the four, like Brett was saying, that ideas are coming first. And so that it's like ideas are all that matter, and the ideas are ahistoricized. So the ideas are persistent through time. This is a perpetual issue. The division is always going to be there. It's always been there. Again, that's totally non-historical. The majority of the existence of the human race was not existing in class society. It was existing in more communal arrangements, smaller, but more communal arrangements. And so this ahistoricization and this focusing on ideas fundamentally flaws the whole discussion. So you can't speak intelligently about important social and political change when we all know we're right on the fucking cusp of one. You can't speak clearly about it because your perspective, your fundamental philosophical commitments are incorrect. They're just wrong. They provide you a poor basis for making analyses of phenomenon that are having an effect on you every day. So you again, as Sam expresses many times in this, are just mystified. And then Goldstone is just like, well, why are you mystified? Like, it's just elites doing what elites do. Sometimes they do it and sometimes they don't. And when they do it, it fails. Like, that's not too hard. It's like simple. History is irrelevant. It's just like game theory. That's all you have to know. I'm a sociologist at, a very fancy school. Like, it really shows to me the value of the analysis. Like, you don't even have to say Marxism, but you can use, like Mike Duncan does, use this perspective, and it allows you to illuminate so many more interesting things and to understand so many more aspects of historical movements and things that have happened in the past and connect them with the present in a way that allows you to understand what the fuck is happening now, so that you don't think a single New York Times article would somehow change U.S. fucking tax policy. It's insane. But Brett, I'm going to let you have the last word. Wrap it up.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I loved the discussion with all three of you. It was really engaging. Couple closing points. Bourgeois intellectuals like this, they play the role that the priests played under feudalism, which is to naturalize the hierarchy. And if you want to naturalize a system, you have to eschew its historical roots and its possible, dialectical evolution into the future, because it has to be a static thing that exists through space and time. And by not talking about capitalism as a system that was born, lives, and dies, you naturalize the hierarchy, you eschew dialectics, and you make it seem like it's the natural order of things. That's what these folks do, without even probably being fully aware that that's what they're doing, although on some level they certainly are. Second thing is economic discontent. The fascist riot on Capitol Hill could be seen in part to be something like a reaction to economic discontent, but it's not the economic discontent of the masses, of the toiling working class. It's the economic discontent of largely the petty bourgeoisie in the middle, going through a proletarianization process, downward economic pressure due to the crisis that capitalism gives rise to. The petty bourgeois is always the class strata that is the primary class within a fascist movement. And we're seeing that in the US, just as we saw it in Italy, in Germany, in Chile, and a million other places. Last thing, a system like a Bernie Sanders social democracy, the system that the elites so often mock, even liberal, left-wing, progressive elites that love Joe Biden and Kamala, Bernie's too radical. We're probably on the left of Bernie, so we think he's not radical enough. Ironically, though, he would be the thing, or at least his idea of social democracy would be the thing that could extend the lifespan of capitalism and provide it with the legitimacy it so desperately needs. And it's the one thing that the Democrats and the Republicans are united on. Never that. That's too radical. And that is an irony that we're going to continue to see play out. And I'm interested how exactly that will play out. But yeah, great conversation. Very humbled to come on and speak with you all.
Yeah. It's been awesome to have you guys on. And I want to make sure we give a shout out. So Brett, you're the host of Rev Left Radio. Check that out. What is this, revleftradio.com or something? What is it?
At revolutionaryleftradio.com. You can find Rev Left, Red Menace, and our new show, Guerrilla History.
Yeah, so the motherfucker's got 3 of them, and he's coming on this one too. So Jesus Christ, man. Cinar is the co-host of All Things Co-op, and so we just went to video as the Sensible Socialist did. So now check out the videos of our episodes and stuff like that. Basically focused on cooperatives and the relationship between cooperatives and socialism, which I think is an important topic. And I think Brett, as a either former or still in your heart a libertarian socialist, it probably appeals to your sensibilities as well. And I know it does Aaron, but Aaron is working in his secret layer on things. I'm
just catching up on podcasts these days. Honestly, that's all I do. Just listen to podcasts, trying to catch up.
Catching up on and participating in. That's classic. Making it worse for everybody else. Well, all right, you guys. Thanks a lot for talking about this. Sam Harris, if you for whatever reason are listening to this conversation and have gotten through the hour and 45 minutes, which your podcasts are 2 hours long, so whatever. Seriously, like as much as there is a kind of making fun of, we're not trying to take you not seriously. We do take you seriously, and we want you to talk about these issues in the way that you talk about other issues, because I think that we've just really identified a hole in your theoretical thinking. And as somebody who seems like the kind of person who would want to plug that hole, we want you to prove us wrong that your economic position and your family history may be clouding your judgment. So, take it in stride, and we have the best of intentions, and I'll definitely meditate on this conversation later. All right, you guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.